If you're watching this, then you probably know a bit about early computers in movies and how they could spend weeks rendering out a single 10-second shot. But there's one thing that's always bugged me. Film, at the time, was a practical medium, physical reels of celluloid exposed to light. Computers are kind of the opposite of that. What you see on your monitor does not have a physical form, it's digital. So how did they get those digital images out of the computer and onto the celluloid of a film frame? And actually, another thing, this is what a computer terminal looked like back in the 1970s. And this is what movie computer graphics were capable of. How did movie makers create rich 3D animations before desktop software? And hang on, TV channels in the 80s had all sorts of CGI. How is that possible? 4 years ago I asked some of these questions on creativecow.net, and my world opened up thanks to the responses. If you don't want to hang around, the answers are A. Pointing a film camera at a monitor, B. The computers were incredibly powerful, and C. Futzing with how a TV works. But those short answers don't even touch the surface of this fascinating period in filmmaking history. To explain further, I need to talk about anti-aircraft guns, the BBC, kinescopes, Scanimate, the Foonly F1, and the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. First, I'm going to need to explain a little about how both film and television work. Film frames contain a layer of silver halide crystals. These crystals darken when exposed to light. Exposing a frame of film for a fraction of a second before moving the film strip for the next frame means you can record a moving image. Develop this film to prevent it darkening further, and once you have cut, taped or edited your final film, it is time to display it by blasting it with direct light to cast its semi-transparent shadow, or projection, onto a screen. Incidentally, film screens are coated in metallic paint to reflect more light than just white, hence the term silver screen. The addition of sound and colour film are fascinating stories themselves, but that's getting off topic here. To clarify, the process of film recording is very much an organic process. Moving on to explain TV, and for now let's stick with the early pre-digital era, television cameras use photosensitive selenium or lead conductors deposited on a metal plate. As light falls on this plate, the resistance of the conductors alters an electrical charge being passed through the plate. The resistance varies by the amount of light on the conductor. This alters the electrical charge, and that creates an electrical signal. A signal which can be transmitted. Cathode ray tube televisions take this transmission and use it to alter the strength of an electron beam as it scans across a grid of phosphors. As a beam hits a phosphor, the phosphor glows momentarily. Just long enough that, thanks to our eyes' persistence of vision, we see a picture form from all the phosphors. The beam's movement is controlled by magnets deflecting the beam from top to bottom and side to side. For television, the path the beam takes is precisely timed, determined by the frequency of the alternating current signal that powers the TV. That's just genius! Scanning, transmitting and recreating an image based off the built-in frequency of the power supply. This process is somewhere between the physical nature of film and the digital environment of computers. It is electronic or analog. These dots of phosphors can be thought of as similar to pixels but with some major differences. Remember, they are the end result of an analog electrical signal. Cathode ray tube televisions had a resolution of 720 dots by 576 in the UK, 525 in the US. This resolution later became known as standard definition. And this was way before the days of retina displays. Larger screens just meant larger dots, and the gaps between the phosphors were visible unless you were a distance away. For comparison, 35mm film is said to have an equivalent resolution of 5400 by 3600 pixels. That's the number of crystals on a frame of film. And early computers had outputs to create television-type signals, so you could view their displays on CRTs. So the first problem to solve: how do we get a TV signal to appear on film? Enter the BBC, the UK's state broadcaster, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the people who own Doctor Who and not Downton Abbey. They started television transmissions in 1929, paused them during the Second World War, and started again in 1945. All transmissions were live, and once complete, then they were lost. No archiving, no reruns. Showing a repeat of a drama meant getting all the actors back and re-performing it. By 1953, the need to archive live transmissions suddenly became super important for the state broadcaster, because TV cameras were going to be allowed into Westminster Abbey to televise the first ever coronation of a queen. A queen who at the time was head of state in some form to 70 countries, comprising 300 million people, a large percentage of which wanted to watch the ceremony. Getting the pictures to those people wasn't possible via live broadcast because TV satellites didn't exist until the next decade. The only option was to record on film and ship it overseas. The BBC's Telescene department in the basement of Lime Grove Studios led the research. They started with the premise that to capture a broadcast onto film, the only solution was to point a film camera at a television. That would allow them to record the live TV broadcast and ship that. Enter the Telescene, a large bulky television in a black box to prevent light spill, with a large bulky camera pointing directly at it. This created so many problems that with each solution came compromises and other fixes. For instance, in the UK, television signals are transmitted at 25 frames per second, and film is recorded at 24 frames per second. So frames of film wouldn't be correctly exposed and potentially out of sync. To solve this, the BBC overcranked the film camera to shoot at 25 frames. It is the practice in this country to ignore the small departure from motion picture standards, and to make film recording at 25 frames per second, which then gives a simple relationship. Another problem was the gaps in the phosphors. This was dealt with by overpowering the electron beam so the dots took longer to dim, bleeding into the neighbouring dots. This also countered the Maurer effect, where lines create patterns of interference, but overpowering the dots led to blurry images. A third fix was needed because CRT televisions actually drew alternating frames, to enable the electron beam to cover the whole grid in time. They do this by skipping every other line, and then on the next pass those lines are filled in. For the Telescene's film camera, that led to a juddered look in the final image. So the BBC developed the suppressed frames system, which simply drew only one set of lines, cutting the vertical resolution from 576 lines to just 288. And yet, despite all these problems and compromises, they managed to record the coronation and ship it to faraway lands like Canada and Australia. Telescenes, or kinescopes, still operated well into the 1980s. A completely different technology eventually replaced film recorders for the purposes of archiving magnetic tape, the thing that VCRs use, or use because it's 2024 now and not 1996. But that's in the future as far as this history goes, and we've got a lot more early stuff to cover. Next, we have to talk about computer animation. Before I jump into getting computer animation onto film, I better clarify what I mean when I say computer animation, because there were two different computer technologies developing in parallel: analog and digital. Aren't all computers digital? Well, yes, but it depends how you define computer animation. Lost to history, the first computer animation was created at MIT in 1950 by someone now only known as Sexanian, bouncing ball animated across the screen. Probably something like this. Within the same decade, John Whitney Sr. buys an old World War II anti-aircraft gun controller, the Kerosene Predictor. Whitney uses this to manipulate a beam of light to trace shapes directly onto movie film. Whitney begins pre-programming these patterns, recording them onto black and white film, then adding colours through his handmade optical printer. Optical printers are fascinating in their own right, and I've already made a video about those. Whitney's work appears in dozens of films, including the famous title sequence for Vertigo. He's rightfully known as the father of computer animation. At about the same time, inventor Lee Harrison began similar experiments. But where Whitney Sr. was working with just the electron beam and deflecting it, Harrison's experiments took him to deflecting television signals. Instead of drawing the top left corner of an image in the top left, why not rotate it? Or have it move from the center into place, which makes it look like an image is zooming into position, or even eventually collapse the whole image into an apparent sphere. Harrison called his invention Animac, which then developed into Scanimate. Live TV images bending, warping, folding and flying on and off screen. If you watched any television in the 1980s, you'll have seen Harrison's invention in action. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about Scanimate, Grayscale Gorilla made a mini-doc for LinkedIn about them. It's linked in the description below. While Scanimate was primarily used for television, it was used in a few movies, including the Death Star behind Yavin display in Star Wars. Which brings us neatly back to the main topic, and how the second problem of getting computer graphics onto film was solved. How to overcome television's resolution. Founded in the 1960s, Information International Inc., also known as III, specialized in creating high-resolution CRT monitors, mainly for the print industry. When I say high resolution, I mean really high resolution. The team at III boasted that they were able to display resolutions higher than film grain, about 5,000 pixels. Imagine it, 5K televisions 50 years ago. The BBC has only just begun the process of shutting down SD channels this year. By 1974, Gary Demos joined John Whitney Jr., the son of the guy from earlier, to lead the entertainment technology group within III. They were intent on taking the company's existing technologies to revolutionize filmmaking. Imagine you're John Whitney Jr., and your dad is hailed as the father of computer animation. I don't know how Whitney Jr. arrived at III, but I'd find it hard to believe he didn't seek out a company specializing in manufacturing one of the key components needed for computer animation, those high-res TVs. And Gary Demos had a fascination with the idea of applying computer technology to movie making too. He was a fan of Whitney Sr., having been inspired by his work while Demos was at Caltech. A year earlier, Whitney Jr. freelanced at III to create this sequence for 1973's Westworld, processing an image to create a robot's eye view. With this prestige project completed and the dream team of Whitney and Demos, they approached III's board with a proposal to combine one of their PFR-80 monitors with DEC PDP-10 computers and a movie camera to create the first of its kind, a digital film printer. And to do all that in time for Westworld's sequel, 1976's Future World, where Gary Demos created a 3D replica of Peter Fonda's head and produced nearly a minute of film in the final cut, including the first digital composite. Digital film printers are amazing in themselves. I had assumed from lots of sources that the first digital film printer involved the Foonly F1, created by Dave Poole, Phil Pettit and Jack Holloway at Foonly Inc., and it certainly was one of the first. Indeed, III was Foonly Inc.'s first customer, although III also brought their experience into this deal, commissioning from the recent Stanford graduates a machine to handle the computer rendering. One cute anecdote is that the name Foonly comes from an error generated by the PDP-10s. Foo is not a legal identifier, or Foo NLI, Foonly. The team behind Foonly Inc. were brought together in the early 1970s as part of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, or SAIL, a DARPA-funded project to replace the PDP-10 computers. Animations were prepared on smaller computers, where operators would often create shapes through pure coordinates. Graphical interfaces like 3ds Max or Cinema 4D were a decade away at least. There was no Bezier handles, no easy ease keyframes. Any curves either in animation or modelling were set by hand. Once an animation was ready, it was transferred to the PDP-10 or Foonly F1. In essence, this American refrigerator-sized processor was a graphics card, capable of creating 5K images with 3 colour channels. If you open Photoshop today and use the channels panel, you can reproduce what I'm talking about. Each image with red, green and blue channels was written to the PFRs, programmable film readers, washing machine-sized units of memory, I just want to reiterate how early all this was in computer development. There was no memory chip industry. There were no testing procedures for the chips being supplied to III. Of the first 8 chips delivered by Mostek, Demos says 7 of them were bad. In the next batch of 8, another 3 failed. III had to develop their own testing software, which they ended up sharing with Mostek. The PFRs could each hold a single image. Once rendered, it was displayed on the massive 5K monitor. The red channel was displayed first, with a red filter over the camera, which was loaded with colour film. Then green, and then blue followed in the same way. The camera was wound on to wait for the next image. The rendered image was then deleted. It couldn't be stored and the memory space was needed for the next frame. I'm glossing over a lot here, yet again. As Creative Cow poster and VFX expert Steve Bentley explained to me,
at that time, all the digital film scanners were only 8-bit, and there just isn't enough headroom in an 8-bit image to apply a LUT, lookup table, to the color information and have it converted so you can do post on it for one, and then put it back on film with an 8-bit rasterizer to put it back onto film. And so you end up with these dull whites, and you end up with blacks that fall off too quickly before they turn into, your shadow often has edges as opposed to this nice smooth diminishment into blackness. So that was one of the biggest issues early on. You were also getting bloom from the CRT that was in the film recorder, because when you turn off a TV set, if you turn off the lights in your room, it'll glow for a few minutes. So when that electron beam goes by on the screen, it's lighting up the pixel, and you can see it, and then when it turns off, that pixel's still lit and is still exposing the film.
Some systems used a moving physical mask and scanned the image onto the screen line by line. This was much slower, but kept the contrast up because the mask kept the constant glow off the rest of the screen from exposing the film. Eventually, lasers would replace CRTs, burning the colours onto the film pixel by pixel. But that was far off in the future of the late 90s, when the Oscar-winning ARRI laser would take Hollywood's VFX to the next level. After the successful delivery of effects for Future World, the team at III continued to improve and develop the technology. This including pitching sequences for The Empire Strikes Back, where they created 2 versions of the X-Wing and had 5 low-poly versions pull off a shot that would be impossible for models. And despite efforts to dirty up the look of the X-Wing, George Lucas rejected III's efforts, not least because it would exceed a set budget of $7,000 per frame. According to the internet, the buying power of that today is nearly $30,000. But another way of looking at it is you could almost buy a house for that in California in 1980. And that's for 1 frame, multiply that by 24 frames per second. Lucasfilm aside, III did win the contract to produce shots for Tron, but Demos and Whitney left the company to found Digital Productions. There they built their own digital film printer, this time with a Cray XMP supercomputer as the renderer. Costing $15 million, the Cray had 64-bit floating point 16MB main memory and 64MB subsystem memory. It could generate up to 12 minutes of film per month. It required 100,000 watts to run and was cooled by liquid freon. And while George Lucas passed on CG X-Wings, yes, that George Lucas, rejecting CGI, III's model of the X-Wing did get printed on the cover of Computer magazine, and most likely led to Digital Productions winning the gig for The Last Starfighter. If you've not seen that movie, you didn't miss much. The Last Starfighter tells of a war for the galaxy, and the losing good guys come up with a plan. Find new pilots by recruiting those who can beat a video game. It's hokey, definitely of its time, and I loved it. The hero ship, the Gunstar, still looks great to this day. By 1986, Digital Productions was acquired by Omnibus in a hostile takeover, and unfortunately Omnibus declared bankruptcy a year later. III's movie production arm ended with the success of Tron. Those early pioneers achieved their goal. They had spent a decade proving that computer graphics could be used for high quality production. The door had been opened and effects companies had taken note. Gary Demos would go on to receive an honorary Oscar for his pioneering work. The Scanimate team went on to develop Caesar, a live-action character animator for TV. And the telescene department at the BBC is long gone. These were the people who invented the processes and even the terminology we take for granted when we add to render queue. Towards the end of writing my script, I stumbled across this retrospective of III by YouTuber Gorkab. It's packed with interviews and anecdotes, it's well worth a watch. And I'll leave you with one last nugget. The term CGI, which we probably all know is an acronym for computer generated imagery, looks like it was also used as the file format for the Quantel rendered shots in Star Trek The Next Generation. I stumbled across this during my research for the next video in this series, where I'm looking at the history of blue screen, why that colour, how pioneers pushed for a film that played to its strengths, and all the variations such as the sodium light crystal and the UV mats used in Star Trek The Next Generation.